For thousands of years, the sands of time have hidden the secrets of a great civilization. Majestic pyramids, vanished cities, mysterious priests and pharaohs who considered themselves gods. How did ancient Egypt become a modern state, and what secrets of the past are still changing our world? From the rise of the first pharaohs to the conquest of Alexander the Great, from the rule of the Ptolemies to the secret conspiracies of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt has survived wars, revolutions, and upheavals, but has always remained the cradle of civilization. But what if ancient prophecies still control its destiny? What mystery links the pyramids and modern technology? And how did Egypt, which changed the course of history, find itself on the threshold of a new future? Welcome to a journey through time. This is the history of Egypt you didn't know yet. Pre-dynastic period of ancient Egypt covers more than 5,000 years of history and is the time of formation of the Egyptian civilization. This was the stage when the first human communities developed on the territory of Egypt, the first forms of social organization, culture, and religion emerged. During this period, Egypt was not yet a unified state, and its territory was a multitude of independent tribes and small communities, each of which existed on the basis of tribal and territorial ties. However, despite their political fragmentation, these communities gradually began to develop technology, culture, and religion, which later played a key role in the formation of Egypt as a great civilization. Egypt, like many other ancient civilizations, emerged from fertile lands washed by a great river. The Nile, flowing through the country from south to north, was vital to the existence and development of these early communities. The river provided abundant and regular floods that resulted in extensive water meadow areas and deposits, creating favorable conditions for farming. The fertile soil, saturated with minerals from the overflows, became the basis of Egypt's agrarian economy. The seasonal flooding of the Nile, which lasted for more than 4,000 years, allowed for the development of irrigation systems and organized farming, which provided the first surplus of food and allowed for the establishment of larger, more stable settlements. While for many civilizations the waters were a source of threat, floods, for Egypt the floods of the Nile were its main asset, which made the land prosper. Prior to settled settlements, Egypt was home to nomadic tribes who hunted, gathered, and traveled in search of food. However, starting around 10,000 BC, due to the warmth and humidity of the region, Egyptians began to settle along the Nile, establishing the first settlements. This marked the beginning of the transition from a nomadic lifestyle to sedentarization, an important step for the formation of stable and more complex social structures. At this time, the transition from primitive gathering and hunting to more organized agriculture began. This changed the whole structure of society and led to the need for better and more rational use of natural resources. Surrounding areas began to be planted with cereal crops such as wheat and barley, and domestic animals such as goats, sheep, and cattle were raised. Tribes created simple tools and built dwellings from natural materials such as stone, wood, and thatch. Farming became the basis of their livelihood, and waterways such as the Nile helped transport food and goods. As the population increased and agriculture improved, the first settlements appeared and gradually became larger and more organized. These settlements began to develop into settlements that began to structure their social and political relationships. Land distribution and control over natural resources were becoming an important factor in community life. At this stage, a social hierarchy emerged in the community, with the chief or tribal elders becoming the primary managers and enforcers of primitive laws. With the development of settlements as well as the growth of human population, the need to organize economic life increased. The first agricultural communities began to use more advanced tools and adopted the first forms of irrigation and water supply, which enabled them to regulate farming and increase crop yields. Canals were dug along the Nile River to manage the water, and the inhabitants began to build more sophisticated farm structures and tools, which also facilitated increased trade and exchange with neighboring tribes. One of the most important aspects that began to develop during this period was religion. Although Egypt was not yet a unified state, different communities and settlements began to create their own religious practices, cults, and gods. Already during this time, the cult of the Nile, which represents not only life but also death, appears. The water of the Nile was a crucial element in Egyptian religious life, and many deities, such as Hapi, the god of abundance associated with the flooding of the Nile, occupied an important place in the pantheon. In addition, the first forms of predicting the future and divination appeared during this period. The priests began practicing astronomy and observing the movement of celestial bodies. This knowledge was used both for agriculture and religious rituals. The temple complexes in the early stages were not yet as large as in later periods, but even then, one could see the beginnings of a priesthood that would eventually become an important part of Egyptian society. Mythological ideas about life and death also developed during this period. Stories emerge about the gods and their relationship with humans, the cosmic order, and the struggle to sustain life on Earth. These myths, such as the myth of Osiris and Isis, would remain an important part of Egyptian culture throughout its history. During the process of sedentarization and the development of agriculture, the first steps in art also begin. Already in this period, the first forms of decorative art began to appear. Jewelry, amulets, clay, and woodwork. People began to make everyday objects, as well as the first forms of art related to religious cults. At this time, people used local materials to create the first artifacts, for example. Clay vessels decorated with geometric and natural motifs were made. During this time, they also began using stones such as quartz and basalt to create the first stone implements and tools, and later figurines and cult objects. Interestingly, art during this period was not only associated with the aesthetic side of life, but also with magical practices, which served as an important part of religious and daily rituals. For example, amulets, often depicting gods or protective spirits, were worn as symbols of protection from evil forces and disease. With the development of settlements and agriculture, exchange between different communities gradually increased. Trade in goods such as grain, fish, tools, and the first trade routes along the Nile and to neighboring regions began. The emergence of exchange stimulated the development of various crafts such as weaving, metalworking, and pottery making. This facilitated the first trade routes and links with neighboring territories such as Nubia and Libya. Interaction with other cultures also led to the assimilation of new technologies and materials. For example, the Egyptians learned to make bronze tools, which greatly improved their agricultural and construction capabilities. The pre-dynastic period in Egyptian history was an important milestone on the way to creating one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity. This period, although it was not a period of unity and centralized state, was the basis for the country's further development, giving rise to agriculture, social organization, religion, and art. Over time, Egypt developed into a powerful state whose culture, religion, and achievements in art and architecture have left an indelible mark on human history. The dynastic period of ancient Egypt, covering the period from 3100 to 2686 BC, was the time when Egypt was finally formed as a unified state and began to develop all of the cultural, political, and social elements that had come to characterize Egyptian civilization over the millennia. This period begins with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the establishment of the Pharaonic dynasty, and ends with the creation of what would later be known as the Old Kingdom. The founder of dynastic Egypt is considered to be Pharaoh Narmer, also known as Menes, who, according to tradition, united the two Egypts, Upper and Lower, around 3100 BC. According to legend, Narmer defeated his rival, the ruler of Lower Egypt, and united the country under his rule. Some sources claim that Narmer was the first pharaoh to become the ruler of a unified Egypt, thus beginning the dynastic era. The unification of Egypt was an important event that brought political stability and allowed for economic, cultural, and religious development. Evidence of Egypt's unification can be found in archaeological finds, such as the famous Paleolithic Narmer stela, which depicts the pharaoh's victory over his enemies and his triumphant unification of the country. The stelae served not only as a monument of victory, but also as a symbol of the new political order where the pharaoh became the supreme ruler of all of Egypt, uniting two regions, each with its own culture and traditions. The unification was also reflected in the symbolism. Narmer became the first pharaoh to wear two crowns, the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, which symbolized his authority over all the lands of Egypt. After the unification of the country, Narmer moved the capital to Memphis, strategically located in the center of Egypt, on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis quickly became the political, commercial, and religious center of the country, housing the most important institutions, temples, and palaces. The city's location on the Nile and its proximity to important trade routes ensured its prosperity and development. Memphis became a symbol of Egyptian unity, as well as the center of Egyptian power and bureaucracy. It was here that the pharaohs established the first systems of government, which included a complex administration and a retinue of officials. This laid the foundations for the later Egyptian bureaucracy, which lasted for thousands of years. In this period, the first rudiments of a legal system with rights and duties for both the pharaoh and his subjects also began to take shape. The basis of governance was the institution of the pharaoh as a divine ruler who had authority over all aspects of life. During the dynastic period, the hieroglyphic writing system was actively developed. Initially, the Egyptians used various forms of symbols to record important events and administrative acts, and over time, a more complex and varied writing system emerged to record and transmit knowledge. Hieroglyphs became an important tool for recording historical events, religious texts, laws, and court decisions. Unlike modern alphabetic systems, Egyptian hieroglyphs combined symbols that stood for sounds as well as whole words or ideas. This writing was used mainly for writing on stone and clay slabs in temples and tombs, and on papyrus, which would later become the main material for scribes. It is during this period that the first texts appear that describe the activities of the pharaohs, as well as legends, myths, and religious precepts. Over time, writing became an important tool in religious life, with the help of which the text of rituals, prayers, and cult songs were recorded. During the dynastic period, the religious system that would leave a deep mark on Egyptian history began to take shape. At this time, the first major temples dedicated to the major Egyptian gods appeared. The early cult of the pharaoh also became increasingly important, and he began to be seen as a divine figure, not only a political leader, but also a mediator between the people and the gods. One of the most important deities of this period was Ra, the sun god, who would later become the main god of Egypt. Other deities such as Osiris, Isis, and Horus also held an important place in religious life. Temples and sanctuaries in this period began to be built on special places that were considered sacred, and at the court of the pharaoh there appeared a retinue of priests who were responsible for conducting rituals and cultic actions. An important moment in the religious life of that time was the development of the idea of Ma'at, the concept of truth, order, and harmony in the world, which became the basis of justice and moral foundations of Egyptian society. With the establishment of dynastic power in the territory of Egypt, a complex social structure began to form, where the most important places were occupied by the pharaoh and his immediate entourage. An important part of the social hierarchy were also priests, high officials, and local rulers, nomarchs, who governed various regions of the country. Workers and artisans occupied the lower rungs of the social ladder, but they were also granted certain rights. This period saw the emergence of a developed system of taxation and labor obligation, which allowed Egypt to support the administrative apparatus and construction projects. Trade also played an important role in Egypt's economy. It traded extensively with neighboring countries such as Nubia to the south and Libya to the west. During this period, trade routes along the Nile began to take shape, as well as exports of gold, jade goods, copper, and bronze implements. One of the most significant achievements of the dynastic period was the development of architecture, including the construction of the first tombs of the pharaohs. Already at this time, the largest tombs of rulers began to be built, and it was then that the first pyramids appeared, symbolizing the power and greatness of the pharaohs. The most famous example of early pyramidal architecture is the Pyramid of Djoser in Saqqara, built during the Third Dynasty. It was the first stepped pyramid and is considered the precursor to future great pyramids such as the Pyramid of Cheops. The construction of the pyramids symbolized the idea of eternal life and the pharaoh's connection to the gods, and also served as his burial place. The dynastic period of ancient Egypt was the time of formation of a unified state based on a powerful bureaucratic system, developed religion, and architectural achievements. It was the period when Egypt began to develop those traditions that became the basis of all Egyptian civilization for thousands of years to come. The political unification of the country, the establishment of centralized authority, and the development of writing began the great achievements that would shape Egypt's culture throughout its history. The ancient kingdom of ancient Egypt, also known as the Age of the Pyramids, is one of the most striking and significant periods in the history of Egyptian civilization. It was a time when Egypt reached a high level of centralized power, and the pharaohs became absolute rulers with unlimited power. This period also saw the construction of Egypt's most famous architectural monuments, the giant pyramids, which became symbols of the Egyptian monarchy and the greatness of the pharaohs. However, despite the grandeur and prosperity, this period was also marred by internal conflicts and political decline, leading to the collapse of the ancient kingdom. The ancient kingdom began in 2686 BC with the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, the founder of the Third Dynasty. He was the first pharaoh to fully consolidate the power of a centralized ruler in Egypt. During this period, a powerful bureaucratic system was finally established that allowed Egypt to function as a unified state that controlled all aspects of life, from agriculture and crafts to religious practices and the judicial system. One of the most striking examples of the centralization of power was the construction of the first pyramids, including the famous step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. This pyramid became an important symbol of pharaonic power and the ambition of the ruler. Construction of the pyramids became the basis for the deployment of the state system, which included the development of a dense network of officials and able artisans directed to fulfill state orders and construction projects. Egypt during this period was beginning to become a more connected and systematized state. The greatest architectural and cultural legacy of the Old Kingdom is associated with the development of pyramid construction. Pyramids became not only important religious symbols, but also powerful testimonies of pharaonic power. Pyramids served as tombs for pharaohs where they could resurrect in the afterlife and continue to rule in the world of the gods. The most famous were the pyramids built during the Fourth Dynasty, during the reign of the pharaohs Cheops, Chephren, and Mycaren, which make up the famous pyramidal structure at Giza. The Pyramid of Cheops, also known as the Pyramid of Cheops, or the Great Pyramid, is the largest and oldest of these pyramids and the only remaining wonder of the world. It was built as a tomb for Pharaoh Cheops, and its size, about 146 meters high, is impressive even by modern standards. In addition to the pyramids at Giza, many other pyramids and tombs were built throughout Egypt during this period. This period also saw the tradition of building not only pyramids, but also the famous sphinxes, stone statues with the body of a lion and the head of a pharaoh, which represented the protection and power of the pharaoh. The social structure of the Old Kingdom was strictly hierarchical and reflected the Egyptians' idea of divine order. At the top of this structure was the pharaoh, who was not only a secular ruler, but also a divine being, a mediator between the gods and the people. Next came the highest officials such as viziers, governors, nomarchs, and high priests who governed the various regions and territories of the country. Local officials also played a key role in the administration of Egyptian lands, collecting taxes, and ensuring order. The economy during this period was largely based on agriculture, particularly the cultivation of cereal crops such as wheat and barley, as well as herding and fishing. Control of land was the most important aspect of power, and the pharaohs used central administration to allocate resources efficiently and shape the tax system. Trade was also an important part of the economy. Egypt traded extensively with neighboring countries such as Nubia to the south, Libya to the west, and Syria to the east. Trade brought goods such as wood, copper, precious stones and jade to Egypt, which were used in crafts and construction. Religion in the Old Kingdom was a crucial part of Egyptian life. The pharaoh was considered not only a political leader, but also a divine ruler, an incarnation of the god Ra on earth. That is why pharaohs built giant temples and conducted numerous religious rituals associated with worshiping the gods and strengthening their power. The veneration of Ra as the sun god, as well as Osiris, the god of the afterlife and rebirth, Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic, and other deities became the basis of religious life. Pharaohs were also often depicted in temples and on monuments as divine beings akin to deities. In addition to the cult of the pharaoh, the religion of Egypt also developed the idea of an afterlife, which became increasingly complex. The Egyptians believed that the soul of a deceased person continued its existence in the afterlife, and this required preparing his body and soul for eternal life through special rituals and burial. At the turn of the 22nd century BC, with the 22nd dynasty, Egypt experienced a crisis due to the weakening of centralized power and increasing political instability. The causes of this crisis were multifaceted. One of the main reasons was the over-centralization of power, when the pharaohs and the central authority began to lose control over distant regions and nomes. Local rulers, nomarchs, began to accumulate more and more power and wealth, which contributed to the growth of feudal sentiment and the weakening of central authority. Another important factor was economic weakening, which may have been caused by agricultural problems, labor shortages, the decline of trade routes, and possibly climate changes affecting crop yields. In addition, the ever-increasing costs of pyramid construction and government projects led to a deterioration of the state's financial position. Internal conflicts, power struggles between pharaohs and nomarchs, and deteriorating foreign trade led to an overall weakening of Egypt. By the end of the 5th dynasty, Egypt entered a period of political instability that culminated in the decline of the Old Kingdom and the transition to the first transitional period. The ancient kingdom was the time of prosperity and greatness of Egypt, when the foundations were laid for the further development of Egyptian civilization. Development of architecture, construction of pyramids, strengthening of pharaonic power, development of economy and culture. All this was possible due to a stable and strong center of power. However, internal problems and political instability at the end of this period led to decline, which was the beginning of a new stage in the history of Egypt. But the influence of the Old Kingdom left an indelible mark in Egyptian history. The first intermediate period in the history of ancient Egypt, 2181 to 2055 BC, was a time of political and social crisis when the country experienced a breakdown of unity and faced internal and external threats. This period was marked by power struggles between different regions, a dramatic weakening of central authority, and the invasion of nomadic peoples, which led to the political disintegration of Egypt. However, despite all the instability, the situation eventually stabilized, and the pharaohs from Teba in Upper Egypt were able to restore the unity of the country, bringing an end to this devastating period. The first intermediate period was the result of the economic and political crisis that plagued Egypt after the end of the Old Kingdom era. During this time, the pharaohs lost control over many of their territories, and local rulers, nomarchs, began to establish their power and independence. The reasons for the decline were multifaceted and involved both internal and external factors. Economic problems. Large-scale construction projects such as the Pyramids required huge resources. This depleted national wealth and increased the tax burden, which in turn undermined economic stability. Feudalization of power. Nomarchs, local rulers, increased their influence and gradually gained independence from the central government. Their wealth grew and they became more and more powerful, creating feudal estates which weakened the power of the pharaohs. Social and political conflicts. In times of instability and crisis, conflicts often arose between different segments of society, as well as within the elite. The power of the pharaohs weakened, and the struggle for the throne became constant. Disruption of trade routes and climate change. Climate problems, such as the lowering of the level of the Nile and the disruption of trade routes with neighboring countries, may also have played a role in the decline of economic and political stability. As a result of these factors, Egypt disintegrated into several independent kingdoms, causing its political disintegration. The country split into two main parts. Upper Egypt, south, remained relatively more stable. During this period, rulers were formed on its territory who were located in the city of Thebes, modern Luxor. They became some of the most influential nomarchs, and it was they who eventually played a key role in restoring Egypt's unity. Lower Egypt, north, was more prone to internal conflict and invasion by nomadic peoples. During this period, separate independent city-states formed in Lower Egypt, which fought among themselves for power and resources. Thus, Egypt was divided into several small kingdoms, each of which had its own power, army, and economic system. Local rulers, particularly in Thebes, became effectively independent rulers who claimed authority over the entire country. As Egypt sank into political instability, its vulnerability increased, leading to invasions by nomadic peoples such as the Asiatic peoples or Levantines. These groups probably came from Palestine or the Sinai Peninsula, and their raids exacerbated the situation. They attacked Egypt, destroying cities and taking resources, further weakening the already disorganized state. Individual cities and territories, especially in Lower Egypt, fell victim to attacks by these nomadic tribes. Although the specific details of these invasions remain unclear, sources suggest that they were an important factor contributing to the further decline of Egypt during this period. After years of fragmentation and chaos, power was once again in the hands of pharaohs who reestablished the unity of Egypt. One such ruler was Menachem III of Thebes, who eventually managed to unify the country, after which he established his authority as pharaoh, proclaiming himself the founder of the 11th dynasty. The pharaohs from Thebes used their support from local military and religious leaders to consolidate their power and assert control over the various nomes. They embarked on successful military campaigns against other rulers and consolidated their position against a backdrop of political disintegration. There was also an active effort to rebuild temples and religious centers, which played an important role in strengthening Egyptian identity and regaining trust among the population. Thus, in 2055 BC, thanks to the efforts of Pharaoh Menkaure and his successors, Egypt was unified again, ending the First Intermediate Period. This marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, which was a time of reconstruction, consolidation of central authority, and economic growth. The first intermediate period was an important turning point in Egyptian history. Despite the temporary disintegration of the state, it was during this period that the foundations were laid for a return to unity, which later led to Egypt's prosperity in the Middle Kingdom. The division of the country into independent kingdoms and the struggle for power between them became lessons for future generations of rulers who tried to avoid mistakes and strengthen centralized power. In addition, internal conflicts and external threats, such as invasions by nomadic peoples, served as a cautionary tale for Egypt, emphasizing the importance of the stability and strength of a unified state. Nevertheless, despite all the difficulties, the first intermediate period was not the end of the great civilization of ancient Egypt. It was only a temporary phase after which Egypt returned to its glorious heyday. The Middle Kingdom in the history of ancient Egypt is a period of revival, stability, and prosperity that lasted from 2055 to 1650 BC. After decades of political fragmentation and crisis in the first intermediate period, Egypt once again became a unified state thanks to the efforts of the pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties. During the Middle Kingdom, Egypt was once again at the center of political, economic, and cultural life in the Eastern Mediterranean. This period is characterized by the restoration of power, economic growth, the development of science and art, and significant military victories. However, despite these successes, at the end of the period during the 12th dynasty, Egypt faced new crises related to the invasion of nomadic peoples and internal social problems, which eventually led to the weakening of the country and the transition to the second intermediate period. The Middle Kingdom period begins with the restoration of Egypt's political integrity after the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the first intermediate period. The dynasties that ruled in disintegration were replaced by the pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, who began the process of unifying Egypt. Menachem II, one of the first pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, played a key role in restoring unity. His reign was marked by the strengthening of centralized authority, the restoration of political stability, and the elimination of the threat of local rulers claiming independence. After the unification of Egypt, rulers of the 12th dynasty, such as Amenemhet III, Senusert and Amenemhet II, continued efforts to strengthen the state and expand its influence. This period was the heyday of pharaonic power, and Egypt once again became one of the leading states in the region. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom actively pursued military campaigns aimed at both strengthening Egypt's position within the country and expanding its influence beyond. Unlike previous periods when Egypt was engaged in a struggle for survival, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom actively sought opportunities for expansion. Wars with the Levant and Nubia. One of the main goals of the pharaohs during this period was to expand Egypt's territory towards Nubia and the Levant. Campaigns in Nubia allowed Egypt to control important trade routes and resources such as gold and other minerals, which strengthened the economy. Egypt established fortresses in Nubia, providing protection from external threats and laying the groundwork for future mining of precious metals. Wars with the Levant, Palestine, and Syria. During the reigns of pharaohs Senusert I and Amenemhet II, the Egyptian army undertook campaigns into the Levant, where Egypt established control over some important trading and strategic points. These campaigns strengthened Egypt's influence in the Eastern Mediterranean and provided access to valuable resources. These military successes strengthened the political position of the pharaohs and allowed Egypt to assert its dominance in the region. One of the most important achievements of the Middle Kingdom was the improvement of agriculture and the development of irrigation systems. Irrigation systems were greatly improved in Egypt, allowing for greater crop yields and greater food security. Irrigation canals were expanded, and new canals and dams provided more water for irrigated lands, especially in Lower Egypt, where the level of the Nile was less predictable. In addition, successful irrigation greatly increased the production of grain, which became a major export commodity. This allowed Egypt to strengthen its economy and expand trade ties with neighboring countries, especially Nubia, the Levant, and Phoenicia. Economic prosperity also led to an increase in the wealth of the ruling elite and the development of crafts. New technologies, including improved tools and materials for construction, became widely used in architecture as well as in the production of goods such as glass, pottery, and metalwork. The Middle Kingdom was the heyday of architecture and temple building, which were central to Egypt's religious life. The construction of temples and other religious buildings came to symbolize the greatness of the pharaohs and their divine status. Luxor Temple. One of the most significant architectural projects of the Middle Kingdom was built at Luxor, Thebes, where the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty built magnificent temples dedicated to the gods of Egypt. Luxor became an important religious center where cultic rites and rituals dedicated to the gods were performed. The temple at Luxor continued to serve as the basis for Egyptian religious life for centuries. Pyramids and mausoleums. The construction of pyramids continued during this period, although their size no longer reached the grandeur of the pyramids of the Old Kingdom. Instead, more complex architectural ensembles were built, including tombs, temples, and memorial complexes, such as the mausoleums at Deir el-Bahari, where Pharaoh Hatshepsut was buried. These structures demonstrate the high skill of Egyptian architects and sculptors. The Middle Kingdom was a time of development of Egyptian literature, art, and science. Literature had its heyday during this time, and art became more diverse and realistic. Important literary works were created during this time, such as the Instruction to the Sun, which represents the pharaoh's instructions to his heir, and the Book of the Dead, a crucial text that would become the primary source of religious beliefs and practices in Egypt. Art styles also underwent changes. New ways of depicting the human body appeared in sculpture and painting, making the art of Egypt more vibrant and diverse. The walls of temples and tombs were now decorated with depictions of more realistic and detailed scenes of daily life, as well as scenes of God worship. Despite all the achievements, however, at the end of the 12th dynasty, Egypt again faced a number of problems that led to decline. The causes of the crisis were a combination of internal and external factors. Invasions by nomadic peoples. At the end of the reign of the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, Egypt faced raids by nomadic peoples such as the Hyksos, who came from Asia. They invaded Egypt and conquered significant territories, which led to a weakening of the pharaoh's power and the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. Social and economic problems. The decline in the level of the Nile and poor harvest years led to an economic crisis. Combined with internal political problems such as the struggle for the throne, this set the stage for the weakening of Egypt. The Middle Kingdom left a deep mark on Egyptian history. It was a time of political and cultural prosperity, as well as a time of significant economic and architectural achievements. However, its end heralded the next crisis in the country's history, with the invasion of the Hyksos and the transition to a new period of political instability. The Second Intermediate Period in the history of ancient Egypt, which lasted from 1650 to 1550 BC, was a time of political instability, external threat, and internal disintegration. This period was marked by the invasion of the Hyksos, peoples who came from Asia, and took over much of Egypt, establishing their rule for about 100 years. Despite their military and political power, the Hyksos were unable to fully assimilate Egyptian culture, and their rule was resisted and fought to restore Egyptian unity. Eventually, in 1550 BC, Egyptians from Teba, a Theban region in Upper Egypt, liberated the country, ending the rule of the Hyksos. This revolt marked the beginning of a new period in Egyptian history, which saw the restoration of Egyptian power and the beginning of the reign of the 18th dynasty. The Hyksos were nomadic peoples who probably came from Asia, regions east of Egypt such as Palestine and Syria. They were part of a broader migratory wave that covered vast areas in the late Middle Kingdom and early Second Intermediate period. The reasons for their invasion of Egypt remain a matter of debate among historians, but the most likely cause was the weakening of central authority in Egypt and political instability caused by internal conflicts, which made the country vulnerable to external threats. Around 1650 BC, the Hyksos used their military advantages to conquer Lower Egypt as well as parts of Upper Egypt. They established their kingdom, setting up their capital at Avaris, which was located in the Nile Delta. The Hyksos ruled Egypt for about 100 years, from 1650 to 1550 BC. This was a period when Egyptian culture was threatened. The Hyksos did not completely assimilate Egyptian culture, but they introduced several significant changes to Egypt that influenced Egyptian civilization later on. Military technology. One of the most noticeable traces of the Hyksos in Egypt was the new military technology they brought. The Hyksos used chariots, which became an important element of the Egyptian army. Chariots were used to move troops and also as a means of fighting battles. These chariots probably played a crucial role in later Egyptian military campaigns. Weapons. The Hyksos introduced new weapons such as blades, spears, and bows, which improved the military training of the Egyptian army. The Egyptians also began to use armor and other defenses that became standard later in life. Culture and religion. The Hyksos, although they did not assimilate with the Egyptian people, influenced religious practices by introducing certain deities such as Seth, who was the god of chaos and destruction in Egyptian mythology. Temples were built at Avaris, including temples dedicated to Seth, which may indicate cultural interaction and religious change during this period. Nevertheless, despite cultural influences, the Hyksos were unable to fully assimilate the Egyptian religious and political structure. Most Egyptians retained their belief in traditional deities and sought to restore ancient orders. Under the rule of the Hyksos, Egypt was divided into two parts: Upper Egypt, where the Egyptian elite and traditions remained, and Lower Egypt, controlled by the Hyksos. At this time, political life in Egypt was highly fragmented. There were local rulers in Upper Egypt who resisted the Hyksos, but their power was limited. This created constant tension and dissension as much of the population in Upper Egypt wanted Egyptian independence restored. Nevertheless, the Hyksos ruled Egypt as conquerors using military force to hold power. They were unable to completely control all of Egypt, and despite their rule, many Egyptians remained loyal to their culture and traditions. In response to Hyksos rule, resistance arose in Egypt that eventually led to the liberation of Egypt. A major role in the revolt against the Hyksos was played by the Thebans, Egyptian rulers from the city of Theba in Upper Egypt, who began the resistance against the Hyksos, gradually gaining strength. Pharaoh Ahmose I, who became the first ruler from the 18th dynasty and played a key role in the liberation of Egypt. His victory over the Hyksos ended their rule and brought long-awaited peace to Egypt. The battle that ended the fight against the Hyksos took place around 1550 BC at the Battle of Avaris, where the Egyptians under the leadership of Ahmose defeated the Hyksos. After this victory, the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, and Ahmose I became Pharaoh of Egypt, founding the 18th dynasty, which marked the beginning of a new period in the country's history, the New Kingdom, which was the time of Egypt's greatness. The second intermediate period was a time of political disintegration, external threats and military conflicts, but it was also the foundation for Egypt's future successes. The restoration of unity and the expulsion of the Hyksos marked the beginning of a new period in Egyptian history, when the country once again became a powerful and centralized power. The liberation of Egypt under the leadership of Ahmose was not only a milestone in Egyptian history, but also a foreshadowing of the new victories the country would achieve in the future. In conclusion, the second intermediate period is an era when Egypt faced external invasion and internal fragmentation. But through the resistance of local rulers and the struggle for independence, the country was able to regain its independence and enter a new period of greatness. The New Kingdom is one of the most brilliant periods in the history of ancient Egypt, when the country reached the peak of its power, wealth, and cultural prosperity. This period is a time of stabilization and expansion of Egypt, when pharaohs from the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties not only restored the unity of the country, but also significantly expanded its territories. The main events of this period were successful military campaigns, construction of monumental architectural objects, flourishing of Egyptian art and literature. Egypt at this time was becoming a world leader and one of the most powerful states in the region. The period of the New Kingdom begins with restoration of Egypt after the second intermediate period, when Egyptian pharaohs, beginning with Ahmose I, were able to free the country from the Hyksos and return its independence. From this time, Egypt entered an era of stability and prosperity, which became the basis for expanding its influence in the region. Ahmose I, the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, played a key role in liberating Egypt as well as restoring the unity of the country. He led successful military campaigns and increased internal power, greatly strengthening Egypt. This became the basis for further successes of his successors. After Ahmose I, his successors, such as Thutmose I and Thutmose II, ascended the throne of Egypt and continued the policy of expanding Egyptian territories and strengthening Egyptian power. Thutmose III, known as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, became one of the most prominent pharaohs of the New Kingdom. His reign was characterized by extremely successful military campaigns that allowed Egypt to greatly expand its territories. Thutmose III was not only a talented commander, but also a wise ruler who introduced reforms in state administration. He made 17 military campaigns to Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia, which led to the annexation of significant territories to the Egyptian kingdom. Egypt became the strongest power in the region during this period. During his reign, Egypt expanded its power into present-day Lebanon, Israel, Syria, and even to the headwaters of the Euphrates River. After these conquests, Thutmose III became not only a great general but also a successful diplomatic leader who established relations with many neighboring powers. One of the most unusual and controversial pharaohs of the New Kingdom was Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten. He attempted a radical religious reform centered on monotheism, with the worship of only one god, Aten, the god of the solar disk. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to a new city, Akhetaten, modern El Amarna, where the veneration of Aten became the official religion. Akhenaten's reforms, however, met with strong resistance from the priesthood, which worshipped the traditional gods of Egypt, primarily Amun, and did not want to lose its power and privileges. After Akhenaten's death, his son Tutankhamun, despite his youth, abolished religious reforms and restored traditional polytheism. Thereafter, Aten's influence in Egypt quickly waned, and Akhenaten was forgotten and even deliberately removed from Egyptian history. Tutankhamun, who became pharaoh at the age of 9 years after Akhenaten's death, remains one of the most famous pharaohs, although his reign was relatively short and obscure in terms of political events. However, his tomb, discovered in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter, made him world famous. On the throne, Tutankhamun was only a puppet in the hands of senior advisors and priests. His reign left no significant traces on the political map of Egypt, but his tomb, rich in gold artifacts and works of art, became a symbol of the wealth and power of ancient Egypt. Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, became pharaoh in 1279 BC and ruled Egypt for a full 66 years, making him one of the longest ruling pharaohs in Egyptian history. He is considered one of Egypt's greatest military leaders, and his reign was marked by many victories on the battlefield, especially against the Hittite kingdom. The most famous event of his reign was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, where the Egyptian army faced off against the Hittite army. Although the outcome of the battle was controversial, Ramses II declared the battle his victory and used it as an important element of his propaganda. After the battle, Ramses II concluded a peace treaty with the Hittites, which was the first known peace treaty between great powers in history. Ramses II was also known for his building activities. He ordered the construction of many monumental temples, including the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, which became a symbol of his greatness. He also devoted much time to strengthening Egypt's borders and ensuring the country's security. At the end of Ramses II's reign, Egypt began to experience economic and political difficulties. His successors were unable to keep the empire in its former glory, and the country gradually became vulnerable to external threats. Egypt also faced internal problems such as the decline of power, corruption, and the growing influence of the priests. Over time, Egypt began to weaken, and various peoples such as the Hyksos, the Sea tribes, and the Libyan nomads began to infiltrate its territories. Economic and political problems, as well as the weakening of central authority, led to the fall of the New Kingdom in about 1070 BC. The New Kingdom was the time of Egypt's heyday, its power and prosperity. During this period, Egypt became the most powerful and wealthy civilization in the region. Despite some internal and external problems at the end of the period, The New Kingdom era left an indelible mark on history, becoming a time of greatness of pharaohs, architecture and art, and the strengthening of Egyptian culture and religion. The third intermediate period was the time of Egypt's political disintegration and decline, which lasted almost 400 years. This period was marked by weak central authority, numerous internal conflicts, and external threats. Egypt, which had experienced the golden age of the New Kingdom, was in a state of decline and fragmentation, and its territory was divided into several regions, each ruled by its own pharaohs or chieftains. The main features of this period were political instability, power struggles between different dynasties and rulers, invasions by external enemies such as the Libyans, Palestinians, and other peoples who tried to take over Egyptian lands, weakening of central authority. The Egyptian state was torn into several parts, and regional rulers, often of foreign origin, tried to establish their own dynasties. After the death of the last powerful pharaoh of the New Kingdom, Ramses XI, circa 1070 BCE, Egypt descended into a period of political chaos. The war for power between different factions in Egypt led to the breakup of the country into two main regions: Upper Egypt, centered in Thebes, and Lower Egypt, centered in Memphis. After the death of Ramses XI, his power in Egypt weakened, and the countries began to be gradually torn apart by various localized rulers and foreigners, such as the Libyans. This was a period of transition where the pharaohs lost much of their power and stability was lost. The Egyptian state was divided into smaller kingdoms, and internal conflicts became major events throughout the third intermediate period. One of the most significant aspects of the third intermediate period was the invasion and subsequent rule of the Libyans in Egypt. The Libyan 22nd dynasty, which came to power in the mid-10th century BCE, was one of the first foreign dynasties to rule Egypt during this period. The Libyans, who initially served in the Egyptian army as mercenaries, were eventually able to seize power in the country and establish their dynasty. Under Libyan rule, Egypt was divided into several autonomous kingdoms. The Libyans took control of Lower Egypt, and pharaohs descended from Libya began to rule Memphis and other regions. This was an important phase of political instability in Egypt. However, Libyan rulers tried to maintain Egyptian traditions and continue to build temples and monuments. During the Libyan dynasty, there was a revival of cults such as the cult of the god Ammon, and although the pharaohs were weaker than their New Kingdom predecessors, Egypt continued to exist as a culture. One of the most famous members of the Libyan dynasty was Sheshonq, a founder of the 22nd dynasty, who became pharaoh around 945 BC. He became famous for his successful campaign against Israel, where he led a military expedition recorded in the Bible as an attack on the kingdom of Judah. In Egypt, he consolidated his power, but his reign was marred by constant internal conflicts involving power struggles between different parts of the country. Stability was disrupted by a series of conflicts between the local rulers, nomarchs, who governed the various regions of Egypt. This further exacerbated the disintegration of the country. External threats such as attacks by neighboring nations also aggravated the political situation. The period of the Libyan dynasty was completed in the middle of the 8th century BC when the Kushites, peoples from Nubia, came to power in Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty. This was the time of the rise of Nubia's influence on Egyptian politics. Taharqa, one of the most famous pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, was a strong ruler who was able to restore some centralization in Egypt, as well as conduct several military campaigns in Nubia and the Middle East. Although the Kushites attempted to preserve Egypt's traditions, including building temples and maintaining religious authority, their rule was not entirely successful in terms of strengthening the Egyptian state. Egypt continued to suffer from constant internal strife and external threats. At the end of the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt was in even greater decline, and central authority had all but disappeared. Attacks by neighboring peoples, such as the Assyrians, proved crucial to the final fall of the Kushite dynasty and the end of the Third Intermediate Period. In 664 BC, the Assyrians intervened in Egyptian affairs, leading to the fall of the Nubian dynasty and the restoration of Egyptian power. This event marked the beginning of the late Kingdom of Egypt, under which Egypt regained its independence but faced new challenges, including the Persian takeover of the country in the 6th century BC. The Third Intermediate Period was a time of decline and weakening of Egypt, which was due to many factors: internal conflicts, foreign invasions, weak central authority, and the growing independence of local rulers. Egyptian civilization, which had experienced a century of golden prosperity, now entered an era of disintegration. But the preservation of culture, religious traditions, and arts allowed Egypt to gradually regain its strength and influence events in the region. The late period of ancient Egyptian history covers the last few centuries of independent Egyptian civilization and is a time of many political changes, external conquests, and cultural changes. This period begins with the restoration of Egypt in 664 BC and ends with the conquest of the country by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. During these centuries, Egypt experienced several dynastic changes, foreign invasions, and cultural and political transformations that led to significant changes in Egyptian life. Although Egypt remained independent for much of this time, it gradually lost its autonomy as it faced threats from Assyria, Persia, and other great powers of the time. The late period begins with the restoration of Egyptian power after the collapse of the Third Intermediate Period, when the country was subject to Libyan and Kushite attacks. In 664 BC, the Egyptian throne was once again in the hands of local pharaohs. The restoration of Egyptian power occurred under the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate dynasty. This period was a time of relative prosperity and political stability, despite external threats and political changes. One of the most prominent rulers of the 26th dynasty was Psammetichus I, 664 to 610 BC, who was able to consolidate Egypt's power despite the hardships of his time. He was able to effectively unify the country after a long period of fragmentation and break the influence of foreign armies. Psammetichus I restored Egypt's independence by taking measures to strengthen centralized power and strengthen the economy, and by halting the weakening of pharaonic influence. Psammetichus also actively promoted foreign trade, establishing diplomatic relations with other states, including Assyria and Lydia. Necho II, 610 to 595 BC, the next pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, continued the policy of strengthening Egypt. One of the major achievements of his reign was the construction of the famous Suez Canal, which connected the Nile to the Red Sea, opening Egypt to maritime trade with Asia and Africa. Necho also conducted a series of military campaigns in Syria and Palestine, seeking to restore Egyptian influence in these regions. However, the reign of the 26th dynasty, despite its successes, was not long-lasting. Eventually, Egypt faced threats from outside powers such as Assyria. In the early 6th century BC, Egypt was in a very vulnerable position due to the growing threat from the Assyrian Empire. Assyria, one of the greatest world powers of the time, began to expand its borders southward by sending its armies into Egypt. In 666 BC, the Assyrians, under the command of Tiglath-Pileser III, invaded Egypt and subsequently carried out a series of military campaigns. Over the next decade, Assyria continued to intervene in Egyptian affairs, and Egypt came under significant Assyrian control, although local rulers retained the titles of pharaohs. This was a period of waning Egyptian independence and growing Assyrian influence on Egyptian politics. However, the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty continued to rule, although their power was limited due to Assyrian control, and Egypt experienced several military conflicts with the Assyrians. After the death of Necho II in 595 BC, Egypt found itself in a difficult political situation. In 525 BC, Egypt finally found itself completely conquered, but this time by the Persians. The Persian Empire, under the command of Cyrus the Great and his successors, successfully carried out the conquest of Egypt, and in 525 BC, Egypt became part of the Persian Empire. This event marked the end of Egypt's independence for many centuries. The Persians established a province in Egypt, and the country was incorporated into the vast Persian Empire. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, became Egypt's first Persian pharaoh, although he did not seek to interfere much in local affairs, and left a considerable degree of autonomy for Egyptian officials. However, Egypt under Persia became part of a vast empire, and many traditions of Egyptian culture began to fade. Despite political subjugation, the Persian rulers did not attempt to destroy Egyptian culture or religion. Egypt continued to exist as a cultural center, and many Egyptian temples and monuments were restored. However, many traditions, including the role of the pharaohs as divine rulers, were replaced with those more characteristic of the Persian system of government. After the death of Cambyses II in 522 BC, Persia faced internal conflicts and rebellions in Egypt, but Persian power remained throughout. In 404 BC, Egypt temporarily rebelled against the Persians, but was soon reconquered and returned to Persian control. In 332 BC, Egypt experienced the final conquest of its independence with the arrival of Alexander the Great. At this point, the era of independent ancient Egypt came to an end, and Egypt became part of the Alexandrian Empire. However, even after Alexander the Great's conquest, Egypt continued to maintain its unique culture and traditions that would evolve within the Hellenistic civilization. The late period was a time when Egypt faced many external threats and internal political conflicts. It was a period when Egyptian civilization experienced major changes, but its culture continued to persist. This period also marked the end of Egypt's independence, which was first controlled by Assyria, then became part of the Persian Empire, and finally was conquered by Alexander the Great. Egypt during this period faced increasing external pressures but continued to maintain its cultural identity. Despite political changes and cultural transformations, Egypt maintained its uniqueness, making it one of the most majestic and influential civilizations in world history. The Hellenistic period in Egypt's history covers the time when the country became part of the empire of Alexander the Great and was then ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt until the conquest by Rome. It was a period of profound change when Egypt became an important center of Hellenistic culture, and Alexandria became one of the greatest intellectual and cultural capitals of the ancient world. Along with changes in political governance, there were significant cultural transformations, and Egypt became an arena for the interaction of traditional Egyptian customs with Greek philosophy, art, and science. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great, one of the greatest conquerors in history, defeated the last Persian king, Darius III, and conquered Egypt. The conquest of Egypt was relatively easy as the Egyptians, exhausted by Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Not only was Alexander victorious, but he also founded a new city that became known as Alexandria, a majestic metropolis that would soon become the cultural and scientific center of the ancient world. Alexander the Great, inspired by the ideas of uniting East and West, tried to create an alliance between the local Egyptians and the Greek conquerors. He actively supported the Egyptian religion, honoring Egyptian gods and installing himself as pharaoh. In 331 BC, Alexander visited the famous sanctuary of Ammon at the oasis of Siwa, where he was recognized as the son of the god, which greatly strengthened his power in Egypt. Alexander conquered Egypt without destroying the local culture, but rather encouraging its development and strengthening his position in the country. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his empire was divided between his generals, Diadochos. Egypt went to one of them, Ptolemy I Soter, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were of Greek ancestry, and their reign was a time of blending of Greek and Egyptian cultures as the Greco-Egyptian civilization developed in Egypt. Ptolemy I ruled from 305 to 283 BC, established a strict rule in Egypt, but he also took measures to strengthen ties with the local population, such as rebuilding important temples and improving infrastructure. He sought to make Egypt a prosperous state, and Alexandria became its capital. Ptolemy I assumed the title of pharaoh while maintaining a Greek identity, which became the basis of the Ptolemaic political system. The establishment of Alexandria as the cultural capital of Egypt was an important development. The famous Library of Alexandria, which became the largest scientific center of the ancient world, was founded in Alexandria, as well as the Alexandria Museum, an institute where scientists and philosophers such as Euclid, Archimedes, and Galileo worked. The city became the center of Hellenistic culture, a symbol of the union of Eastern and Western civilizations. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, 283 to 246 BC, continued his father's policies, strengthening Egypt's economy and culture. His reign was the heyday of Alexandria, which became the largest cultural and scientific center in the world. Ptolemy II also actively developed trade and navigation, which made Egypt an important link in the trade routes between East and West. This period also saw the creation of magnificent architectural structures, including the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, which became one of the 7 wonders of the world. However, the Ptolemies faced internal problems such as power struggles between members of the dynasty, which led to periods of political instability. Each of Ptolemy II's successors sought to consolidate their power, and internal conflicts and dynastic intrigue became commonplace. The most famous ruler of this dynasty was Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, who came to power in 51 BC at the age of 18. Cleopatra was an outstanding political leader who sought to preserve Egypt's independence in the face of Roman interference. During her reign, Egypt experienced struggles for power and influence, and the queen herself had to make alliances with Rome to maintain her power. Cleopatra VII attempted to restore Egypt's might and consolidate her power through political and personal ties with leading Roman leaders such as Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Her relationship with Caesar, with whom she had a son Caesarion, strengthened her position in Egypt, and after Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Cleopatra became an ally of Mark Antony, with whom she also had children. However, the political situation in Rome was complicated, and the confrontation between Mark Antony and Octavian, future Emperor Augustus, led to the decisive Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian was victorious, and Cleopatra and Mark Antony, unwilling to surrender, committed suicide. After this, Egypt was finally annexed by Rome. In 30 BC, after the death of Cleopatra VII, Egypt became a Roman province. This ended the rule of the Ptolemies and ended Egypt's era of independence. Despite this, Egypt remained important to Rome, being a major supplier of grain to the Roman Empire. Alexandria continued to be a cultural and scientific center, and Egyptian religion and culture persisted, although Rome was already restraining the power of the pharaohs and local rulers. The Hellenistic period was a time of significant change for Egypt. After the conquest by Alexander the Great, Egypt came under the rule of the Ptolemies, who created a unique cultural synergy between Greek and Egyptian traditions. During this period, Egypt became an important center of trade, science, and culture, and Alexandria became the largest cultural center in the world. However, political instability and internal dynastic conflicts led to the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the conquest of Egypt by Rome. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Hellenistic period in Egypt lived on in architecture, art, and science that influenced the development of Rome and future civilizations. In 30 BC, Egypt came under Roman rule, an event that ended more than 300 years of rule by the Ptolemaic dynasty. The pharaohs of Egypt, beginning with Ptolemy I Soter, were descendants of Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt in 332 BC. However, after the death of the last Ptolemy, Queen Cleopatra VII Rome, led by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, carried out the conquest of Egypt and turned it into its own province. This marked the end of the Hellenistic era and the beginning of Roman rule. Egypt, as a Roman province, Egypt became the most important part of the Roman Empire, known as the Egyptian province. By becoming a Roman province, Egypt played a central role in the food security of the Roman Empire. One of the greatest assets Egypt supplied to Rome was grain. The country's vast agricultural lands, irrigated by the waters of the Nile, provided Rome with a strong supply of grain to feed Rome's vast army and growing population. Egypt continued to be a major source of food for the metropolis, and its role as Rome's breadbasket was extremely important, especially during periods of military conflict when other sources of supply could be disrupted. The capital of Egypt remained Alexandria, one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the ancient world. Alexandria continued to be an important commercial and cultural center, although it was now under Roman control. The city remained an important hub for trade between East and West, linking the Mediterranean to India and China via sea routes. During the Roman period, Alexandria not only maintained its role as a center of scientific knowledge, but was also a major cultural and philosophical center where the work of scientists and philosophers continued. The Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, remained in operation and served as a landmark for ships arriving in port. Despite its cultural prosperity, however, Roman administration gave Egypt the role of an exclusively agrarian province, and unlike other parts of the Roman Empire, Egypt had almost no major cities seeking independence. Roman authorities focused on efficient agricultural management, taxation, and strengthening their military position on the eastern frontier of the empire. Under Roman rule, Egypt did not undergo a forced replacement of its religion, and traditional Egyptian gods continued to be honored. Egyptian temples remained centers of religious life, and the culture of ancient Egypt retained its forms. Gradually, however, Roman customs, Roman architecture, and Roman law began to spread in Egypt. The Egyptians themselves had to adapt to life within the Roman Empire. With the adoption of Christianity in the Roman Empire beginning in the 1st century AD, there was a change in the religious life of Egypt. Christianity began to spread actively among the Egyptians, especially in Alexandria, where the first Christian bishop appeared as early as the beginning of the 2nd century AD. By the 4th century AD, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine the Great. This process changed the cultural landscape of Egypt. Roman authorities did not interfere with the traditional veneration of Egyptian gods, but as Christianity spread, old pagan cults began to die out. The Roman Empire promoted the spread of Christianity, which in turn led to the destruction of many ancient temples and religious buildings. Egyptians, like many other inhabitants of the Roman Empire, began to move more and more to the new religion. The population of Egypt during the Roman period faced certain difficulties. Amid economic prosperity based on agriculture and tax collection, peasants generally faced harsh living conditions as they had to perform labor duties and pay high taxes to support the Roman administration and army. Egyptian peasants were not happy with their lot and often revolted against the Roman authorities. One of the most significant revolts was in 115 to 117 CE, when, in response to economic pressure and high taxes, the Egyptian population revolted, which was brutally suppressed by Roman troops. In 395, the Roman Empire was finally divided into western and eastern parts, and Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern part of Rome. Byzantium continued to control Egypt, And despite many social and religious problems, the country remained an important economic and cultural center. Religious struggles and Christianization. The Byzantine Empire, as a Christian power, actively promoted the spread of Christianity and the destruction of pagan cults. Religious pressure on the Egyptians increased. Byzantine policies caused resentment in Egypt, where there was a strong ancient Egyptian heritage and pagan tradition. Christianity became more dominant with each decade, and the old beliefs faded away. From the end of the 4th century, Christian monasteries became active, and the famous Alexandrian school of Christian theology was founded in Alexandria. The most important theologians and philosophers of Christianity, such as Origen and Athanasius the Great, worked here. It was during this period that Christianity finally triumphed and Egyptian culture underwent significant changes. It is noteworthy that with the development of Christianity in Egypt, the struggle between Christian currents began. The monastic movement was actively developing in Egypt and became a significant part of the Christian tradition. However, with the development of Christianity, struggles over religious issues began. In particular, Egyptians, like many others, were involved in religious disputes, such as the dispute over the Nicene Creed and Monophysite theology, revolts and internal conflicts. Byzantine control over Egypt was not flawless. In the 6th century CE, the country experienced several revolts due to popular discontent, social injustice, and economic hardship. The most famous revolt was the 484 revolt, which was suppressed by Byzantine soldiers. But it showed the depth of the population's discontent. During this period, Egypt was also attacked by Persians and Arabs. In the 7th century, after several decades of instability and civil wars, the Byzantine Empire was unable to provide a defense against Arab conquest. In 641 CE, Egypt experienced one of the most significant events of its history, the Arab conquest. Led by the commander Amr ibn al-As, the Arab army, on behalf of the Rashidun Caliphate, defeated the Byzantines, who had ruled Egypt since Roman rule. This event was a pivotal moment that ushered in the long Islamic period in Egyptian history and caused massive social, cultural, and religious changes. Amr ibn al-As, acting on the orders of Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab, landed on the coast of Egypt in 641. Egypt, which at that time was under the rule of the Byzantine Empire, found itself weakened after years of fighting foreign invaders and internal conflicts. Despite some defense on the Byzantine side, the Arabs quickly overran Egypt. They passed through the country's major cities, including Alexandria, which was one of the most important cultural and trade centers of antiquity. The capture of Alexandria was an important moment, as this city was the main port and cultural hub of the Eastern Mediterranean. After the fall of Alexandria, the Arabs began their campaign to consolidate power throughout Egypt. Amr ibn al-As founded Fustat, the first Arab city, which became the capital of Egypt for several centuries. The city was built in 641 and became the basis for the further spread of Islamic civilization in Egypt. The Islamic conqueror not only established new political structures, but also began to profoundly transform the social and religious life of Egyptians. Egypt became part of the Arab Caliphate, and along with the Arabs, Islam, a new religion, came into the country and soon became the dominant religion in Egypt, displacing Christianity. With the adoption of Islam, Egypt began to undergo a significant transformation. One of the Arabs' first steps was to establish Islamic law, Sharia, which gradually replaced Byzantine and Roman legal norms. The Christian Church, which had hitherto been the leading religious force in Egypt, came under pressure. Over the course of several centuries it lost ground, and many Egyptian temples were converted into mosques. In particular, the famous Serapeum Temple in Alexandria was turned into a mosque, and Christian monasteries were downsized or closed. For many Egyptians, Islam was not just a religion, but part of a new cultural identity. Arabic, which was the language of the Quran, gradually became the main language of communication, displacing ancient Egyptian dialects and Greek, which still continued to be used in public affairs in the first decades of Arab rule. Muslims actively promoted the Arabic language, and over time, Arabic culture penetrated into the lives of Egyptians. At the same time, not all Egyptians immediately embraced Islam. Many Christians, who made up a large part of the country's population, kept their faith. However, over time, under the influence of the Arab administration, more and more people converted to Islam, which became a necessity for social and economic change. On the other hand, those who remained Christian were required to pay jizya, a tax on non-Muslims, which also encouraged many Egyptians to adopt the new religion. Egypt's economy, like the rest of the Arab Empire, was based on agriculture, and the Nile continued to be the country's main artery. Under the Arabs, the irrigation system was improved, which greatly increased agricultural yields. Egypt continued to be an important supplier of grain, especially to the Arab world, and an important trading hub linking the East to the West. Roman and Byzantine traditions of governance were retained in the Arab administration, but a new social structure was introduced based on the Islamization of society. Over time, Arab culture and Islam became the basis for new political and cultural norms, which ensured the stability of Arab rule in Egypt. In 969, an important political and cultural shift occurred. The Fatimids, a Shiite dynasty, came to power in Egypt. The Fatimids were opposed to Sunni Islam, which dominated the Arab world, and established their own capital in Egypt. At this point in Egypt, Cairo was founded, a city that quickly became the center of political and religious life in the region. The founders of Cairo, the Fatimid caliphs, decided to move the capital of Egypt from Fustat to a new location, more secure and with greater potential for growth and prosperity. In 969, the new city was laid out, and its rapid development came to symbolize a new era in Egyptian history. Cairo, founded by the Fatimids, became the most important cultural and scientific center of the Arab world, where philosophy, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and literature flourished. The Fatimid period was a time of significant social and economic changes. They greatly strengthened the influence of Islam in Egypt and made Cairo the most important cultural center and one of the largest cities in the world. Al-Azhar, one of the oldest universities in the world, was built during this time and is still in operation today. Under the Fatimids, the Islamic religion and Arab culture became even more influential. At this time, the process of Islamization of the population increased significantly, and despite the surviving Christian community, Islam became the dominant element in Egyptian cultural life. Islamic architecture, literature, and science began to develop in Egypt. Mosques, schools, and libraries became symbols of the flourishing Islamic culture. The Fatimids also actively supported the development of art and architecture. They built majestic mosques, palaces, and other cultural sites that left a vivid mark on Egypt's architectural heritage. Many of these buildings still stand today in Cairo and other cities throughout the country, testifying to the great cultural flourishing of the time. The period from 641 to 969 was a time of dramatic change for Egypt. The Arab conquest brought Islam and Arab culture, which had a profound effect on all aspects of Egyptian life. The Fatimid Caliphate, founded in the late 10th century, was a milestone in Egyptian history, and Cairo, as the new capital, became the center of the Islamic world where culture, science, and religion continued to develop. After several decades of Fatimid rule, a period marked by strong cultural, religious, and architectural development, Egypt entered a new era. The Fatimids, despite their merits in strengthening Islamic culture, faced internal political and religious conflicts as well as external threats such as the Crusaders, which weakened their position. In this context, a new player emerged on the Egyptian political scene. Saladin, or Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a man who would play a key role in restoring Egyptian power and fighting the Crusaders. In 1169, during the reign of the last Fatimid Caliph, Egypt was on the verge of decline. Internal unrest, social unrest, and power struggles were weakening the country. And the Crusaders continued to invade Egypt from the north, seeking to establish their position on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. During this period, however, Saladin, the vizier and army commander of the Fatimid Caliphate, appeared in Egypt. Saladin was of Kurdish descent and served in the army of Shirkuh, his uncle and ruler of Egypt, as part of the Fatimid army. In 1169, after Shirkuh's death, Saladin took over the rule of Egypt, and he soon began to consolidate his power, deciding to eliminate the Fatimid dynasty. In 1171, Saladin officially abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and announced the establishment of the Ayyubid dynasty. The Ayyubids were a Sunni dynasty, unlike the Fatimids, who were Shia. This change was an important step in strengthening Sunni Islam in Egypt and the region, as well as stabilizing power. Saladin, choosing to focus all his efforts on restoring Egyptian power and defending Islamic territories, greatly strengthened Egypt's economy, repaired irrigation canals, and restored trade, which raised Egypt's status in the Arab world. His greatest merit, however, was his fight against the Crusaders, who continued to threaten Islamic lands. One of Saladin's main objectives was to liberate Jerusalem, which was under Crusader control at the time. Jerusalem was an important religious and strategic center for Christians, but it was also a holy site for Muslims. Saladin focused his efforts on liberating this city and strengthening Islamic influence in the region. In 1187, Saladin was able to achieve victory over the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. This victory was a decisive moment, and Saladin soon took Jerusalem, bringing it back under Muslim control. This event brought him great fame and recognition in the Islamic world. His ability to govern wisely, his humanity towards the people of the city, as opposed to the brutal methods used by the Crusaders, and his determination became symbols of his rule. Saladin also strengthened his position in Syria, Iraq, and other Middle Eastern countries by organizing a coalition against the Crusaders and seizing key territories. He reunited the Islamic world, which had been divided between various Sunni and Shiite states, and became one of the most famous Muslim rulers of the time. After Saladin consolidated his power in Egypt and liberated Jerusalem, he also began to expand his holdings in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. His most important military achievements were his victories over the Crusaders in a number of battles, as well as regaining control of trade routes. The Ayyubids also greatly improved Egypt's economic situation by rebuilding irrigation systems, strengthening infrastructure, and revitalizing trade. Egypt, and especially its capital Cairo, once again became important centers of culture, science, and trade in the Islamic world. Under Ayyubid rule, the level of education in Egypt increased significantly, and a number of schools and madrasas, Muslim educational institutions, were established at this time to promote science and philosophy in the region. After Saladin's death in 1193, Egypt and other Ayyubid possessions passed to his children and relatives. However, internal conflicts and power struggles between different members of the dynasty led to a weakening of political stability. The Ayyubids were unable to maintain the unity of the state, and independent principalities began to emerge in some regions. The rulers themselves, despite their efforts, were unable to stop the decline, and power struggles became one of the causes of the Ayyubid crisis. At this time, the economies of Egypt and Syria were also struggling. However, for a long time, Egypt remained an important cultural and religious center of the world, despite political instability. Amid the weakening of Ayyubid power in Egypt, the Mamluk class, the paramilitary slave servants who served the rulers of Egypt, began to gain strength in the early 13th century. The Mamluks were originally slaves, but over time, they began to occupy important positions in armies and administration. In time, they organized their own political force. In 1250, the Mamluks overthrew the Ayyubids and took power into their own hands. As a result, Egypt became under Mamluk rule, and the Ayyubid dynasty came to an end. The Ayyubids left an important legacy in the history of Egypt and the Middle East. Under their rule, Egypt became the most important center of Islamic culture, science, and religion. Saladin, as a symbol of the struggle against the Crusaders, will be remembered as one of the greatest rulers in the history of the Islamic world. He restored and strengthened the Islamic presence in the region and was instrumental in the liberation of Jerusalem, a decisive moment in the history of the Crusades. The Ayyubids also contributed significantly to strengthening Egypt's economic and social structure, restoring agriculture, and promoting trade. Despite their successes, however, the dynasty was unable to hold on to the unity of Egypt, and their rule ended with the rise of the Mamluks. In 1517, Egypt was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, an important event in its history. The conquest was carried out by the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, who sought to consolidate the Ottoman Empire's power in the Eastern Mediterranean and control key trade routes. Egypt was an important strategic region at the crossroads of trade routes between East and West, and its control allowed the Ottomans to have direct influence over crucial trade and communication routes. Before the conquest, Egypt was ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate, a dynasty that came to power in Egypt in the 13th century and played an important role in the political and military life of the region. The Mamluks were a military elite composed of slave warriors, and they controlled the country despite attempts by other states, such as the Ottomans, to interfere in its affairs. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt was the result of a brutal campaign in which Ottoman Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluks in several battles. He entered Egypt in 1517, and after winning the Battle of Radania, southwest of Cairo, he killed the last Mamluk Sultan, Tumanbay. This effectively ended Egypt's independence and its political role as a separate state. Egypt was annexed to the Ottoman Empire as part of a province, but with the preservation of local administrative and cultural features. After the conquest, Egypt became one of the Ottoman provinces, and although the local elite remained in place, control of the country and political power was transferred to the Ottoman rulers. During the first decades of Ottoman rule in Egypt, the local elite and the old power structures, including the Mamluk chiefs, retained considerable influence. The Ottomans maintained a system of governance in which the most important positions, including governors and military commanders, were held by both Ottoman and local representatives. The Mamluks, though they lost their political independence, continued to be influential figures in Egyptian politics. After the conquest, Egypt became an Ottoman province known as the Egyptian Eyalet. The administration of the province was organized so that the Ottoman sultans retained full control. However, local rulers called walis, governors, governed Egypt on behalf of the sultan. At first, the walis were usually appointed directly from Istanbul, and their power was limited in time. However, local influential families, including the old Mamluks, who retained considerable influence in the region, were also involved. It is important to note that the Mamluks continued to come to power in Egypt, but they were now part of Ottoman authority rather than independent rulers. Over time, Ottoman power became more distant and weaker, allowing local elites, including the Mamluks, to play a more active role in the governance of the province. The Mamluks, who had once been slaves and later became army commanders and high-ranking officials, gradually began to turn into feudal lords. They developed a system in which they wielded considerable influence in local politics, but officially remained under Ottoman control. Egypt's governance thus became hybrid, combining elements of Ottoman administrative control with local peculiarities. However, Egypt's local rulers and elites increasingly began to act independently, especially in the economic and military spheres. In particular, they made extensive use of a kind of autonomy in agriculture and taxation, which allowed local rulers to increase their power and independence. Egypt remained an agrarian society, and its economy was heavily dependent on agriculture, especially the produce from the Nile. The Ottomans supported Egyptian agriculture by improving irrigation and other systems, but cereal crops continued to be the country's main source of income. Egypt was the most important producer of wheat, barley, and other agricultural commodities that were exported to other parts of the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Local rulers largely controlled these resources and used them to consolidate their power. Taxes on agriculture remained the main source of income for both the Ottoman authorities and local elites. Nevertheless, despite its dependence on agriculture, Egypt was also an important commercial and cultural center, especially after Alexandria again became an important port for trade with Europe and Asia. During the period of Ottoman rule, Cairo and other Egyptian cities continued to play an important role in the cultural life of the Arab world. Egypt remained the center of Islamic education and culture. Cairo was home to famous educational institutions such as Al-Azhar, one of the oldest Islamic universities, and other schools and madrasas that attracted students from all over the Muslim world. At the same time, the Ottomans did not interfere with the traditions and beliefs of Egyptian Muslims. Islamic culture continued to develop, and Islamic temples and mosques remained important centers of social life. During these years, new mosques were built throughout Egypt, and old ones were expanded and decorated. However, the Ottoman Empire, despite its power, was unable to maintain perfect political stability in Egypt. Constant crises within the Ottoman Empire itself, the intervention of European powers, and internal conflicts between local elites and the Ottoman authorities made Egypt vulnerable to external and internal threats. Beginning in the late 17th century, Egypt gradually faced economic and political difficulties due to the weakening of Ottoman authority and the growing interference of external powers. This became especially evident in the 18th century when European powers such as France, Britain, and others began to increase their influence in the region. At the same time, local authorities, including the Mamluks, became more independent, leading to increasing political instability. The Mamluks began to have their own armies and competed intensely for influence in Egypt. This weakened Ottoman central authority and allowed local elites to play a more important role in governance. The Ottoman Protectorate, while powerful, became susceptible to serious external and internal threats, and at the juncture of the 18th and 19th centuries, Egypt found itself on the threshold of a major political transformation. The Ottoman period in Egypt was a time of political adaptation as well as cultural and economic prosperity. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517 changed the political map of the region, but the Ottomans largely allowed local elites and traditions to persist. Although Egypt remained an important agricultural and trading center, the eventual weakening of Ottoman control and growing local independence led to political instability that preceded the intervention of European powers and internal change in Egypt. In the late 18th century, Egypt found itself at the center of world political interests. In 1798, during the Napoleonic Wars, Egypt was invaded by the French under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte. This was an important event in Egypt's history as it brought about significant changes in the political, economic, and cultural life of the country. The French campaign in Egypt was part of Napoleon's wider ambitions to establish French influence in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. French invasion, despite its short duration, had a lasting impact on Egypt, although its goals were not fully realized. Napoleon Bonaparte undertook an expedition to Egypt, hoping not only to expand French influence in the region, but also to disrupt British trade routes to India. In 1798, French troops landed in Egypt, and they soon occupied Caire, the Cairo Valley, and other crucial regions. Napoleon sought to reform the country, create an alliance with local authorities, and introduce European technology, which in turn would give France a strategic advantage in the Mediterranean. French rule was relatively brief, only 3 years, but it left a notable mark on Egyptian history. The French administration implemented several reforms to improve agriculture, science, education, and infrastructure. One of the most famous French initiatives was the creation of the Commission des Sciences et des Arts expedition, which gathered a wealth of knowledge about Egypt. its culture and ancient history, including the famous discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The stone was a crucial key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics and opened the door to archaeological research on ancient Egypt. Nevertheless, the campaign was not militarily successful. After several years of resistance from local forces and British attacks in Egypt, the French army found itself in a difficult position. In 1701, after a series of defeats and a worsening situation, the French were forced to abandon Egypt. Despite the defeat, French influence in Egypt remained prominent through scientific discoveries and cultural exchanges, as well as establishing contacts with the West. Following the French withdrawal, Egypt found itself in a state of political instability, and despite being formally subordinate to the Ottoman Empire, in practice the country was fragmented and weakened. This power vacuum was exploited by Muhammad Ali, a Turkish officer who arrived in Egypt in 1801 as part of the Ottoman army to fight the French. In 1705, with the help of his army strength and political acumen, he became the de facto ruler of Egypt, receiving the title of Wali, governor, from the Ottoman Sultan. Muhammad Ali embarked on radical reforms in an effort to consolidate his power and create an effective polity. He was determined to modernize Egypt and create a strong army, which was an important part of his policy. Muhammad Ali created a new army, trained to European standards, and greatly improved agriculture, especially through the development of cotton farming. He also set about building infrastructure, including new canals, which greatly improved irrigation and agricultural production. Muhammad Ali sought Egypt's economic independence from the Ottoman Empire and other foreign powers. He pursued economic policies aimed at developing industry and reducing dependence on foreign trade. Nevertheless, his efforts to strengthen the country's independence led to tensions with the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt fell into a path of de facto autonomy in the 1830s, despite formal recognition of the Sultan's authority in Istanbul. In the mid-19th century, Egypt found itself at the center of international interests, especially on the part of Britain and France. The geopolitical situation in the region was changing, and Egypt's role as a strategic important link on trade routes, especially in view of the construction of the Suez Canal, made the country the object of intense competition between European powers. The Suez Canal, which opened in 1869, became the most important waterway for maritime trade between Europe and Asia. The Ottoman Empire, weakened by internal conflicts and external threats, was unable to govern Egypt effectively, and the British, in order to control key sea lanes, began to intervene in the country's affairs. By the 1870s, the British had already effectively controlled the financial and economic aspects of the Egyptian economy, especially with Egypt's debt obligations, which were largely related to the construction of the Suez Canal. In 1882, Britain, concerned about growing nationalist sentiment in Egypt and fears for the safety of the Suez Canal, intervened in Egypt's internal affairs. After suppressing an uprising led by Egyptian nationalist Ahmad Urkan, Britain effectively annexed Egypt, taking full control of the country. Technically, Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire, but it became a de facto British protectorate, with Britain exercising actual control through a British-appointed official. Once British control was established, Egypt became dependent on Britain. Britain used the country as an important strategic base to protect its interests in the region and to control the Suez Canal. which became the most important trade and military route between Europe and India. The British administration attempted to preserve local traditions while introducing European principles of governance. In the economy, efforts continued to increase agricultural production, especially cotton, which became Egypt's most important export. Despite some economic successes, most of the profits went to British interests, and the Egyptian population continued to experience poverty. In the political sphere, Britain exercised tight control through the local ruler, Wali, and the British official who effectively ran the country. In this context, the struggle of local elites and intellectuals for influence and national independence began. Various political movements began to emerge in Egypt, including liberal and nationalist currents that sought self-determination and an end to British control. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Egypt became the scene of an active struggle for independence. In 1919, after World War I, mass protests erupted in the country organized by the Egyptian National Union, demanding complete liberation from British rule. Nationalist sentiment grew, and Egypt, despite its formal dependence on Britain, began to move actively toward independence. Nationalist movements led by figures such as Saad Zaghloul played a key role in Egypt's political transformation and its quest for independence in the following decades. After the end of World War I, Egypt gained formal independence from Britain in 1922, but this did not mean full autonomy. The British continued to retain considerable influence in the country, especially in the strategically important area of controlling the Suez Canal and securing their interests in the region. Despite recognizing independence, the British continued to intervene in Egyptian politics by supporting political figures who were favorable to British interests. Egypt was a constitutional monarchy, and on the throne in 1922 was Farouk, who became the new king. Despite formally established democratic institutions, political instability, corruption, and dependence on British policies continued. Political parties such as the Wafd, considered nationalist, played an important role in the struggle for independence and political reform. But they were often interfered with by the British, making it difficult to develop a full-fledged democracy. At this time, Egyptian society remained agrarian, and the economy suffered from an inequitable distribution of resources. About 70% of the population was engaged in agriculture, but the biggest profit was in the export of cotton, which was in the hands of a small elite closely tied to British interests. This created huge social and economic disparities that became a source of discontent and protests among the population. During the first decades of the 20th century, Egypt remained largely under British control, despite formal independence. The protectorate was replaced by a more covert form of control, in which British interests continued to dominate, especially in the military and economic spheres. The British Army retained control of the Suez Canal, a strategically important waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and serving as a crucial transportation route for trade and military needs. Nationalist movements fighting for full independence from Britain began to develop strongly in Egypt. Political parties and social organizations such as the Wafd, the party of Chief Saad Zaghloul, fought for real autonomy for the country. Protests against British rule continued unabated, and many Egyptians sought land reforms and better living conditions for the peasants. Popular unrest demanding economic improvements and political confrontations with the British eventually led to a revolutionary moment in 1952. The main driving forces behind the revolution were the army and radical political groups such as the Free Officers movement. The 1952 revolution was a turning point in Egypt's history. On the night of July 22nd to 23rd, 1952, a group of military led by officers such as Gamal Abdel Nasser, Mohammed Naguib, and others staged a coup d'etat. King Farouk was overthrown and a republic was proclaimed in the country. This coup, dubbed the July 23rd Revolution, was primarily due to popular discontent over political instability, poverty, and brutal pressure in Britain. At the time of the overthrow of the monarchy, Egypt was in an economic crisis, and social structures and institutions were worn down by corruption and poor governance. After the revolution, Nasser became a leading figure in Egyptian politics, and Mohammed Naguib became the country's first president. But Naguib was soon forced to give way to Nasser, who concentrated power in his own hands. Under his leadership, Egypt became a republic, and a reform program was soon launched to modernize the country and expand Egypt's influence in the Arab world. Gamal Abdel Nasser, as the leader of the revolution, sought ambitious social, economic, and political reforms. Egypt embraced Arab socialism, which combined elements of socialist economics and Arab nationalism. Nasser sought to change Egypt's social and economic structure by nationalizing key sectors of the economy, including industry, banks, and agriculture. He implemented agrarian reforms aimed at redistributing land to peasants. Land owned by large landowners was redistributed to the poor, helping to reduce social inequality. Nasser also focused on infrastructure development, including the construction of new cities, hospitals, schools, and universities. In addition, there was a campaign to improve healthcare and education, as well as vigorous industrial development, including the construction of large factories. However, as a result of nationalizations and socialist transformations, there were problems with the efficiency of governance as well as a lack of resources to implement reforms. On the external front, Gamal Abdel Nasser actively promoted Arab nationalism and sought to strengthen Egypt's role as the leader of the Arab world. He was one of the founders of the United Arab Republic, UAR, in 1958. When Egypt united with Syria in an attempt to create a single Arab nation. However, this unification lasted only 3 years, and Syria withdrew from the UAR in 1961. Nasser was also active in the struggle for independence and the liberation of Arab countries from colonialism. His support for anti-colonial movements, such as in Algeria, as well as helping to support revolutionary movements throughout the Middle East, increased his popularity in the Arab world, but also led to tensions with Western powers and Israel. A particularly important event during Nasser's reign was the Suez War of 1956. In response to Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to overthrow Nasser and regain control of the canal. Despite military defeats, Nasser was able to win diplomatically with the support of the Soviet Union and the United States, and the Suez Canal remained under Egyptian control. Nasser passed away in 1970, leaving behind a mixed legacy. On the one hand, he was a prominent leader of the Arab world who sought to foster independence and justice for Arab countries. However, his rule also left many unresolved problems such as economic inefficiency and political repression. Nasser left a deep mark on the history of Egypt and the Arab world. His policies and reforms continued to influence the country for a long time, despite the problems that arose in the following decades. After Nasser's death in 1970, his successor, Anwar Sadat, changed the course of Egypt's foreign policy. Sadat opened the country to Western investment and signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979, which was an important step towards stabilizing the region. However, this peace treaty also displeased many Arab countries and led to some social and political problems within Egypt. In 1981, Sadat was assassinated in an Islamic radical attack and was replaced by Hosni Mubarak, who remained in office until 2011. Mubarak ruled the country with a heavy hand, maintaining an authoritarian regime that led to significant social and economic problems. His rule was marred by corruption, social injustice, and repression of the opposition. This was the catalyst for mass protest in Egypt in 2011. The Arab Spring of 2011 led to the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. The protests were aimed at expressing dissatisfaction with the existing regime, and after months of mass demonstrations, Mubarak resigned. However, the political situation in the country remained unstable, and Egypt experienced several years of political turmoil. In 2013, after a series of protests against President-elect Mohamed Morsi of the Islamic Brotherhood, the Egyptian army led by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi staged a coup d'etat, removing Morsi from power. Sisi became president and initiated a series of economic reforms and a harsh crackdown on the opposition, which allowed him to consolidate his power but drew criticism from human rights organizations. The Egyptian economy is heavily dependent on a number of factors, including agriculture, industry, oil production, and tourism. The country has an important strategic resource, the Suez Canal, which serves as the most important trade artery between Europe, Asia, and Africa. The canal generates significant revenues, but its impact on the country's economy remains limited due to political instability and economic problems. Egypt's oil industry also plays an important role in the economy. The country produces oil and natural gas, and hydrocarbon exports are an important source of revenue. Despite this, Egypt faces energy security challenges, especially as energy demand increases. Agriculture remains one of the pillars of the Egyptian economy. The country is the world's largest producer of cotton and also produces wheat, rice, corn, and vegetables. However, agriculture suffers from water scarcity, river pollution, and insufficient land for agricultural production. Tourism is also an important sector of Egypt's economy. The country attracts millions of tourists every year due to its ancient monuments such as the Pyramids, the temples at Luxor, and the famous resorts on the Red Sea coast and in Sharm el-Sheikh. Despite threats of terrorist attacks and political instability, tourism remains an important source of revenue for the country. However, in recent years, Egypt has faced serious economic challenges such as inflation, high unemployment, and government budget deficits. In response to these challenges, the Egyptian government has initiated economic reforms, including reducing subsidies on goods and services and supporting private investment and foreign loans. Egypt faces a number of social challenges that remain important for the government to address. High poverty rates, rising youth unemployment, and lack of affordable housing are just a few of the many challenges facing Egyptian society. In addition, significant social injustice persists in the country, with wealth concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while millions of people live in extreme poverty. Education and health are also important sectors that require reform. Despite advances in these areas, such as an increase in the number of schools and hospitals, the quality of education and health services remains poor for many segments of the population. The country faces a shortage of highly skilled professionals in a number of key areas such as technology and medicine. Egypt's population continues to grow, and this is putting additional strain on the country's social and economic structures. In 2020, Egypt's population exceeded 100 million, making the country the largest Arab power in terms of population. Egypt remains an important cultural and intellectual center of the world. The country is proud of its ancient history and rich cultural heritage, which attracts the attention of both locals and tourists from all over the world. Egypt has a long tradition in science, literature, philosophy, and art that continues to influence contemporary cultural trends. In recent decades, Egypt has become an important center of Islamic thought, and Cairo is considered one of the largest Islamic centers in the world, especially after the establishment of Al-Azhar University in 970, which is one of the oldest educational institutions in the world and a center of Islamic learning. Egyptian music, cinema, and literature also remain an important part of the country's cultural life. Egyptian cinema has a long history and continues to be one of the leading cinemas in the Arab world, and contemporary writers and artists are active, offering new perspectives on traditional Egyptian culture. Egypt remains an important political player in the Middle East. It is a member of the Arab League and the African Union, and is actively involved in diplomatic efforts to resolve conflicts in the region. Egypt maintains close relations with the United States and the European Union, and plays a key role in the Arab-Israeli peace process. In addition, Egypt is actively working to strengthen its position in Africa by developing economic cooperation with neighboring states and participating in peacekeeping missions. Modern Egypt continues to face many challenges, but despite this, the country remains one of the most important political, cultural, and economic centers in the region. Periodic political crises and economic difficulties do not overshadow Egypt's importance on the world stage.